Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Damien Hines.
One, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today. I'll also be making an announcement about a new minister to join the government. At the end of the year, Stephen Green, the former chair and chief executive of HSBC, will be standing down as Trade Minister after doing a superb job refocusing the government's efforts in key export markets. I can announce today that Ian Livingstone, for the past 5 years chief executive of BT, one of Britain's most successful businesses, will take on this vital role. I believe he will bring huge talent to a vital national effort.
Damien Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister agree that there are many, many pupils in excellent schools benefiting from outstanding teaching from inspirational teachers, not all of whom have necessarily been to Teacher Training College?
No, I think my honourable friend makes an important point. There are many good teachers in our schools who haven't been through the formal processes. I know this week we've had another new policy from the party opposite, banning all such teachers from such schools. As ever, although I've been busy, Mr. Speaker, I've had a careful look at this policy. And I note that there are teachers, people who teach, including those on the benches of the party opposite. The honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, a renowned historian, teaches in his local comprehensive schools. He's going to be banned. And of course, there is the former member for South Shields, who enjoys doing that as well. I think this policy, another shambles, is another example of brotherly love.
Mr. Speaker, following the Parliamentary Commission on Banking, can the Prime Minister confirm that he supports its important recommendations on bonuses and criminal penalties, and that he will use the banking bill to implement them?
Yes, I do support both those measures. Obviously, we need to take time to read this excellent report. And I commend my honourable friend, the member for Chichester, for the excellent job that he's done. But penalising, including criminal penalties against bankers who behave responsibly, I say yes, and also making sure that banks who are in receipt of taxpayers' money, that you can claw back and ban bonuses, I say yes too.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
On the specific issues of criminal penalties, I'm glad he supports the proposal, but will he just confirm for the House on this important issue that the government will put down the appropriate amendments to the banking bill, which is currently going through Parliament, to make sure this gets on the statute book as soon as possible?
No, we will be using that bill to take these important steps, and the key thing is that we have that opportunity. First of all, because we said there should be a parliamentary inquiry that could be done rapidly rather than a public inquiry that he supported. If we'd done that, we'd just about be getting going with the inquiry. Instead of that, we have a good inquiry, good results, and we can have strong legislation too.
Mr. Speaker, just to be clear about this, if the government doesn't put down the amendments on criminal penalties, we will in the banking bill, and we will make sure they happen. Now, I think that the Prime Minister praises the Parliamentary Commission on Banking. But let's turn to one of its recommendations from last year's report. It said the government should legislate for a general power to break up the banks, breaking up high-risk casino banking from high street banks. We think it's right. The Commission think it's right, but the government is so far refusing to implement. The part-time Chancellor is trying to give some advice to the Prime Minister. We think it's right. We think it's right. The Commission think it's right. But the government has so far refused to implement that recommendation. Why isn't the government doing it?
Well, first of all, I would rather listen to my Chancellor than listen to his neighbour, the Shadow Chancellor. Of course, we remember his advice. 125% mortgages from Northern Rock, that's fine. A knighthood for Fred Goodwin, that's fine. The biggest banking bust in British history, that's fine. He was the City Minister when all of this went wrong. And it's this government that's clearing up the mess. As I say, we wouldn't have these results without this excellent inquiry commissioned by this government. We wouldn't be able to legislate if we didn't have the excellent banking bill provided by this government. And in terms of his question, we are putting a ring fence around retail banks, something that in 13 years of a Labour government, although they were both in the Treasury, they never got round to.
I do say to the Prime Minister, we're really not going to take lectures from the guy who was the from the guy who was the advisor on Black Wednesday in 1992. And he had no answer to the question about retail and investment banking. Now maybe he can do better on this issue, on the issue of bonuses, on the issue of bonuses and the banks, Mr. Speaker. Last week's ONS figures showed that bonuses in business and financial services this April were 64% higher than a year ago. Why does the Prime Minister think that is?
Bank bonuses are about a fifth of what they were when he was sitting in the Treasury. They've been going down, not up. And if he wants to discuss this issue of banking, perhaps he would reflect on the fact that the other City Minister that Labour had in their time of office, Lord Miners, had this to say today. The government of which I was a member certainly has to take some culpability for the fact the regulatory oversight of the banks was not as effective as it should be. He goes on, he says, to do otherwise would be to pull the wool over the eyes of the electorate. Perhaps the next time he gets to that dispatch box, he'll apologise for the mess that they made.
He's asking questions and preparing for opposition, Mr. Speaker. Now let's talk about what people were saying in 2008. Because we all remember the speeches, don't we, Mr. Speaker? A Conservative economic strategy, March 2008. David Cameron, and I quote, "As a free marketeer by conviction, it will not surprise you to hear me say that a significant part of the problems of the last decade has been too much regulation." There you have it. There you have it, Mr. Speaker. He was wanting less regulation of the city. And let's just go back to the question about bonuses, because the reality is that bonuses are up 64% in April in the city. And why? Because he's cut the top rate of income tax from 50 to 45p. So people took their bonuses in April and got a massive tax cut as a result. When the Prime Minister gets up to respond, will he confirm that 64% figure and that people are getting a massive tax cut as a result of his decision?
Well, first of all, let me give him the figures. In 2012-13, city bonuses will be 85% lower than they were in 2007 and 8, when those two were advising or working in the last government with the responsibility for regulating the city. And it doesn't matter what he says, he cannot get over the fact that they presided over the boom and bust, the collapse of the banks, the failure to regulate. We remember what they said in 2008. No more boom and bust. They said a golden age for the city. That is what they said. They cannot hide their dreadful record, and they ought to start with an apology.
The whole House will have noticed he cannot deny the figures I read out to him. He doesn't even know the facts. Bonuses are up so that people can take advantage of his massive tax cut. Here is the truth. For all his tough talk, the reality is he's dragging his feet on banking reform. Business lending is still falling, bonuses are rising, and while ordinary families are suffering, he's giving a massive tax cut to the bankers.
Just another display of extraordinary weakness. They had 13 years to sort out this problem. They did absolutely nothing. It is this government that's introduced the banking bill, this government that's introduced the ring fence, this government that's put the Bank of England in charge of regulating credit in our economy. Instead, what we ought to be getting from him is an apology and a thank you for clearing up the mess they left.
Sir Edward Lee!
may I say to the Prime Minister, occasionally one should be grateful. So, may I warmly commend him for being the first Conservative Prime Minister ever to commit to a referendum on Europe, and for leading a government that has done more than any other government to tackle welfare dependency, to reduce immigration and to bring in academies, thereby showing that one can be Conservative, popular and right all at the same time.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question, and can I, on behalf of everyone in the House, congratulate him on his richly deserved knighthood. He has served in this House for many decades, and he also served in the vital role of overseeing the Public Accounts Committee, which does such important work in our parliamentary system. I'm grateful for what he says about the referendum, and I would urge all colleagues to come to the House on July the 5th and vote for this bill.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister proud of the fact that on his watch 300,000 more children have been pushed into absolute poverty?
What I'm proud of is that we have protected the poorest in our country by increasing the child tax credit. But the most important thing we can do to tackle poverty is to get more people into work. There are now more people in work in our country than at any time in our history, and in his own area in the West Midlands, the number of people employed is up 66,000 since the election. And it is worth remembering the last government's record, because even during the boom years, private sector employment in the West Midlands, even in the boom years, it went down.
Steve Brine.
Speaker, I'm sure the Prime Minister will want to join every member of the House in wishing all British players the best of luck for the Wimbledon Championships, which starts on Monday. But looking to the future, does he back the LTA's schools tennis programme, which is now in over 16,000 schools, including a number in my Winchester constituency, such as Henry, Beaufort and Kings, to help find us a future home-grown and home-trained champion?
Now, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. First of all, let's congratulate Andy Murray for his excellent victory at the weekend at Queen's Club, and wish him well and other British players well for the Wimbledon tournament. I think we should commend the LTA for the work they're doing to try and make tennis much more of a mass participation sport. I see it in the primary school my children go to, where more tennis is being taught and played. It's still got a long way to go, and the Lawn Tennis Association have to satisfy Sport England and all of the funding bodies that they're doing everything they can to make this a mass participation sport.
Mr. Michael Meacher.
When, according to the Sunday Times, just 1,000 of our richest citizens have increased their wealth since the financial crash by £190 billion, while everyone else, on average, has been forced to take a 6% real terms cut in income, isn't his policy of enriching the perpetrators and punishing the victims the very opposite of a one-nation Britain?
Well, first of all, the richest in our country are going to pay a higher percentage of income tax under this government than they did under the last government. He sat in that government. He had the opportunity to do something about it. But all the time he was a minister, the top rate of tax was actually lower than it is going to be under this government.
Anne Main.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that if a community is obliged to take a strategic piece of infrastructure, then there should be agreements for payments and compensations for any blight that's caused for a national important piece of structure like a rail freight interchange?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, and that's why Section 106 agreements exist. I think we do need to keep this area under active review, particularly, for instance, with a view for how we're going to handle fracking and shale gas, where I think we might need an even more simple and an even more direct mechanism to make sure that communities feel the real benefit of things that benefit the economy overall.
Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Miliband report showed that the proportion of students from state schools at elite Russell Group universities is now lower than a decade ago. Meanwhile, another report, Project Hero, is secretly considering lifting interest rates on previous graduate loans. After £9,000 tuition fees, does the Prime Minister think that such another breach of faith is more likely to encourage students from less wealthy backgrounds to apply to university, or to discourage them?
Well, I make 2 points to the honourable gentleman, because this is an important question. First is the number of children from disadvantaged backgrounds going to university is higher than it has ever been, so that is a good step forward. But the second thing is, if we want to get children from disadvantaged backgrounds into universities, we should be supporting things like the Academies programme and free schools. Now, we saw in Labour's announcement this week, they're now saying they support free schools. That's great. The trouble is, they then went on to say they're not going to allow any more of them. And then they said this, quite extraordinary, they said this: what we will have is new academies programme, like parent-led academies, really good teacher-led academies, like Peter Hyman's school in East London. They want more schools like that. He's nodding, the Shadow Education Secretary. There's only one problem. That school is a free school. What a complete shambles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister what discussions he's held with the colleagues in DEFRA to amend the priorities Natural England and the Environment Agency so as to recognise the value of productive land and the need to protect farmland in my constituency from flooding?
Well, I do have conversations about this issue with the Secretary of State for Farming and Food and Rural Affairs. As I announced in the House last week, he'll soon be bringing forward the proposal to make sure that the insurance scheme that protected households in danger of flooding is renewed. We also need to make sure that we protect farmland in the way the Honourable Lady says, not least because with global populations rising, the demand for food production is going to increase, and we should make sure that we have a good level of food security in this country.
Mark Hendrick.
Mr. Speaker, the last Labour government took 1 million children out of poverty. Figures released recently show that 1 in 6 children in this country now live in poverty. In my constituency, 1 in 3 is living in poverty, compared to 1 in 10 in his constituency. What's he going to do about it?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, the problem with the last government's legacy is because you left a massive debt burden and a massive deficit, this government has had to take action to deal with it. Now, as I said, the best way to get...
Well, I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. I didn't leave any debt burden, and we'll concentrate on the policies of the government, not the... Order! Order! Nothing further required. We'll move on. Mr. Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever the long-term benefits of high-speed rail, the project is already causing serious worry for tens of thousands of homeowners along the route. Will my right honourable friend give urgent attention and consideration to the possibility of introducing a property bond to remove that blight?
I know my honourable friend is concerned about this issue, and I know that it's right that he stands up for his constituents, and other MPs have discussed this issue with me. First of all, I think we should remain committed to HS2 because it will connect our cities and communities and actually bring many benefits, particularly, I believe, to the north of England as it is built out. But we should look at the compensation schemes available, and we are consulting and listening to the idea of the property bond.
Mr. Nick Rainsford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement following the appalling murder of drummer Lee Rigby a month ago, the Prime Minister announced the setting up of the government's task force on tackling extremism and said we will also look at new ways to support communities as they come together to take a united stand against all forms of extremism. In Woolwich, our diverse communities have been working hard to do just that. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what progress has been made by the task force and specifically what new ways he envisages emerging to support communities such as ours?
Well, first of all, can I commend the right honourable gentleman for all the action he's taken in his own community, and I saw for myself visiting Woolwich how strongly that community has come together to absolutely decry what happened, but to build a stronger future. The task force has met and the first papers and ideas have been commissioned. One particular idea we're looking at is something that I heard while I was with him in Woolwich, which is where, for instance, communities want to come together and try and drive extremist groups out of particular mosques or Islamic centres, they often need help, including help with legal advice to do that. So that's one of the specific ideas, but the action of this task force should cover the whole waterfront from everything we do right across our communities.
Mr. William Cash.
Given the need to improve recognition of the role of women in the developing world, especially in the context of health, education, water and sanitation, business and all other matters which affect administration in those countries, will my right honourable friend take a positive interest in my gender inequality bill, which is coming forward today, and will he note that it is already supported by a very wide range of people, including WaterAid, Great Initiative and others?
Well, I will study my honourable friend's bill closely. It's not the bill that everyone might expect.
Let's hear a bit more about Mr. Cash's bill. I think the Prime Minister's going to tell us. Let's hear about it.
I will certainly study my honourable friend's bills. Not necessarily the bill that we'd all expect him to produce, but I think it sounds like an absolutely excellent idea in co-chairing the high-level panel at the UN about the future of development. I wanted to make sure that gender equality was put right up there in the replacement for the Millennium Development Goals, and it is there. And I think his bill might be able to provide some extra ideas for how to bring this to life.
Julie Hilling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2010, the Prime Minister proudly stated, and I quote, "We actually made sure that neither the budget nor the spending round would result in any increase in child poverty." But in his first full year as Prime Minister, the number of children in absolute poverty rose by 300,000 and is still rising. Will he now admit that he was wrong and his policies are to blame?
Well, we did make a specific decision in the spending round to increase the child tax credit to protect the poorest families in our country. But we had an inheritance from the last government of such appalling levels of debt that it has been difficult and painful to deal with them. But let me repeat the point that the best way to get people out of poverty is to see employment grow. And in the northwest, the part of the country she represents, employment has risen by 6,000 this quarter. It's risen by 50,000 since the election, and unemployment is down 20,000 since the election. Those are all life chances, jobs and chances to get on that people didn't have under the last Labour government.
Julian Brazier.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome my right honourable friend's leadership at the G8 to prevent the horrors of Syria turning into a regional humanitarian catastrophe? And could I urge him to pursue further the support for Lebanon and Jordan, two very fragile neighbouring states, and especially urge him to go further with the support we're providing for the Lebanese army, which is the only cross-confessional organisation in the area and a potential stabilising force.
Well, first of all, I thank him for what he said about the G8. We did make some good progress on Syria, particularly on support in terms of humanitarian aid, where $1.5 million extra was pledged for what is $1.5 billion extra was pledged for what is now becoming one of the worst humanitarian crises we've seen in recent years. He's absolutely right. We need to support the neighbouring states, and we should pay tribute to the Lebanese army, which plays a very important role, and we do indeed fund its activity in terms of some of the border posts.
Mr. Richard Burden.
In response to my honourable friend from Birmingham, Perry Barr, and indeed several times in this question time, the Prime Minister has said that the best way of tackling poverty is to get people into work. In principle, I agree with him, but would he explain this? Why is it that 2/3 of the children in poverty today come from families where there is at least one adult in work? And why is that figure rising?
The point I've made to the honourable gentleman is that work is the best answer for taking people out of poverty. Yes, of course we should continue to pay child benefit, which we do. Of course we should continue with tax credits that we do. And indeed, one of the decisions we made when we came to office was to stop the nonsense of tax credits going to people, including members of this House of Commons, earning £50,000 or more a year. So we're focusing the help on the people who need it most. And yes, we have seen in the West Midlands an extra 66,000 people in work.
Mr. Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, 9 paediatricians wrote to me in the Care Quality Commission expressing serious safety concerns after maternity services at Eastbourne DG8 were downgraded. Since then, Prime Minister, their managers have acted in an intimidating manner. Will the Prime Minister ensure me that reprisals will not be made against these doctors and the managers implement the safety concerns?
Well, as we've discussed before in this House, there should always be safeguards for people who whistleblow and for people who tell the truth about problems in our NHS. And also, I would just make the point that we have completely overhauled the CQC from what was, and the report out today proves it, a totally dysfunctional organisation that we inherited.
Hazel Blears.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a few weeks' time, thousands of young people across the country, including many from my constituency in Salford and Eccles, will be graduating from university and looking forward to getting their first step on the career ladder. Unfortunately for many of them, the only option will be a long-term, unpaid internship that requires them to work for free. Will the Prime Minister therefore make sure that the national minimum wage regulations are rigorously enforced by HMRC to put an end to this exploitation of our young people?
No, I think the Honourable Lady is doing some really important work in this area, and it is a difficult area to get right, because I think we all know from our own experiences that some short-term internships, unpaid, work experience, can be very valuable for people taking part. But on the other hand, what we shouldn't have is employing unpaid interns instead of workers to avoid the national minimum wage. That is the balance we have to get right, and I commend her for the important work she's doing.
Michael Thornton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The excellent Children's Heart Unit at Southampton General is the best in the country outside of London. Yet the recent decision by the Secretary of State means more uncertainty for patients and their families in my Eastleigh constituency. What assurances can the Prime Minister give over the future of this unit?
Well, what I would say to my honourable friend is I don't think the Secretary of State really had any choice but to re-begin this whole process of looking at safe and sustainable in children's hospitals, including Southampton, which is twinned with the hospital that serves my constituency. So I quite understand people's frustration about the time this is taking, but most important of all is to make sure we get the decision right.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own research shows that there is a link between the portrayal of women as sex objects in the media and greater acceptance of sexual harassment and violence against women. That being the case, will he join me in trying to get our own house in order and calling on the parliamentary authorities to stop the Sun newspaper being available on the parliamentary estate until page 3 is scrapped? And will he have a word with his friend Rupert Murdoch about it while he's at it?
Well, I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady. I'm glad she got her question asked after the dazzling T-shirt she was wearing last week failed to catch Mr. Speaker's eye. I'm afraid I don't agree with her. I think it's very important that we can read all newspapers on the parliamentary estate, including the Sun newspaper.
Mr. Marcus Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's leadership on getting the G8 to agree a deal on tackling aggressive corporate tax avoidance. Will my right honourable friend confirm that he will not be offering a corporate tax avoidance service, as does the party opposite?
No, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, which is that at the G8 we achieved real progress on tax transparency, cracking down on tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. But isn't it a sad thing that while we were doing that, the party opposite is still offering tax avoidance advice to its donors, and they haven't paid back the £700,000 of tax that they owe. Let me just remind the leader of the Labour Party what he said. If everyone approaches their tax affairs as some of these companies approach their tax affairs, we wouldn't have a health service, we wouldn't have an education system. So he's got to put his hand in his pocket and give the money back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I wrote to you on the 8th of May and have not yet received a reply. Could I ask you now, have you ever had any discussions with Linton Crosby about the standard packaging of cigarettes or the minimum price of a unit of alcohol? Yes or no? Ask Linton.
I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that Linton Crosby has never lobbied me on anything. The only opinions that I'm interested in are how we destroy the credibility of the Labour Party, on which he has considerable expertise, though I have to say he's not doing as good a job as the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And last year, the Prime Minister successfully intervened in the case of newly born baby Lexi May, who has now eventually been confirmed as the daughter of Private Daniel Wade, who died on active service in Afghanistan. Private Wade's fiancée and her family are in the gallery today. This whole situation, Mr. Speaker, would not have arisen if the MOD routinely kept samples of DNA for those soldiers on active duty. Are we making any progress on this?
Well, my honourable friend does make an important point, and he's quite right to have stood up for his constituents in the way that he did. What I would like to do is to convene a meeting with MOD ministers so I can get back to him with the very best answer about the action we can take to stop these problems happening in the future.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The number of families living in temporary accommodation, homeless families living in temporary accommodation, rose by 5,000 in the last year. Can the Prime Minister explain why?
Well, what we need to do is build more houses in our country, and that is exactly what this government is doing. We're building more social houses, we're building more private houses, and we're reforming housing benefit so we can better use the money. The question now is for the party opposite. They spent weeks and weeks complaining about the removal of the spare room subsidy. I don't know whether anyone else has noticed, they don't ask questions about it anymore. Could that possibly because they haven't got a clue about whether they'd restore it?
Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With an estimated £10 billion boost to our economy, does my right honourable friend agree that a free trade agreement with the United States represents a glittering prize for Britain and for Europe?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I think it's very good news that this free trade agreement has been launched at Lough Erne in Northern Ireland. It will now take many months of very difficult and patient negotiation. It's a hugely complicated problem because we want it to cover all sorts of areas like public procurement and services and not just manufactured goods. But it's good that it's getting going because this could mean millions of jobs right across Europe and great benefits for us here in the UK.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
On the subject of giving money back, which he's just referred to in respect of the Labour Party, will he now explain to the House why, when he had a windfall, he decided to write down his mortgage at Notting Hill instead of writing down the mortgage of the one that he was claiming for from the expenses allowance in the House of Commons?
I think what the honourable gentleman needs to do is concentrate on the massive problem on his front bench. Because I have to say, Mr. Speaker, every week till they pay the money back, they're going to get a question about the £700,000 that they owe to the British taxpayer.
Order.